Good morning. It is Tuesday, May the 24th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the daily declaration for spiritual warfare and the Pledge of Allegiance and the Star-Spangled Banner, we'll have no free lunch, fossil fuels, the second part of Chapter 2, and Chapter 9 of Hondo. All that and more when I get back. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for May the 24th, Biblical Principles to Defeat the Devil. May 24th, great goodness is laid up in heaven for you. I've laid up my great goodness for you. My goodness will continually be in your life. I will withhold no good thing from you. I will give you that which is good and let you increase. I will show you the path of life. In my presence is fullness of joy, and at my right hand are pleasures forevermore. I will give you life and length of days. Psalms 31:19, 52:1, 85:12, 16:11, and 21:4. Prayer declaration. Lord, even with you is the fountain of life, and in your light I shall see light. Your words will be life to my soul and grace to my spirit. You have redeemed my life from destruction and crowned me with your love. Let your blessing fill my life and come upon my family. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for May the 24th, Biblical Principles to Defeat the Devil. And I like to do these every day because the true conservative is religious. And the true conservative is furthermore one of the Abrahamic religions. Matter of fact, those are the only true religions there are. You can be a conservative Jew, you can be a conservative Muslim, you can be a conservative Christian. There is, however, no such thing as a conservative Hindu, Taoist, or Shinto. Back in a minute. Thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is religious. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded and asks why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential. Not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes, he is a normal American. Thank you. What are the 6 biggest mistakes that right-wing talk show hosts make? Number 1, they're neutral. Number 2, they fail to correct their mistakes. Number 3, they demoralize their audiences. Number 4, they contradict themselves. Number 5, they overqualify their statements. Number 6, they think that they have something to prove to the left. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, there's no free lunch. Quote, properly understood, the case for capitalism is not a case for license or for laissez-faire. It is a case for national wealth as a moral good, for the interest of the mass of consumers as the guide of policy, for clear and uniform rules of competition imposed upon all, for letting markets set prices, letting buyers make choices, and letting producers experiment, innovate, and make what they think they can sell, all while protecting consumers and punishing abuses. It is a case for avoiding concentrations of power, for keeping business and government separate, and for letting those who can meet their own needs do so. It is a case for humility about our ability to know and therefore about our capacity to do, unquote. Yuval Levine. Each of the moral aspirations we hope for about our society and each of the economic objectives we have in a free enterprise economy are undermined by an overly cozy relationship with business and government, where the coercive power of the state is allowed to pick winners and losers. Our case for a market economy is a noble one, but it is undermined from start to finish when we fail to condemn the insidious effects of crony capitalism. And that was, there's no free lunch. Thank you. And now, part 2 of chapter 2 of the book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. So when we left this chapter, it was, why is so much energy, the question was made by the author, why is so much energy not made from alternatives to fossil fuels? The hazelnut energy problem. The simple answer is because it's a really hard challenge to produce cheap, plentiful, reliable energy for billions of people. And the fossil fuel industry is the only one, by a mile, that's figured out a solution. Although there's one source of energy that may well outcompete fossil fuels in 3 to 5 decades. Stay tuned. A brilliant illustration of this appeared on, of all places, Saturday Night Live a few years ago. The host of Weekend Update segment at the time, Jimmy Fallon, commented on a plan to use oil derived from hazelnuts to power a car. I have no doubt that this could work technically. Vegetable oil and petroleum oil are extremely similar chemically, but I wasn't excited, and neither was Fallon. New Scientist magazine reported that in the future, cars could be powered by hazelnuts. That's encouraging, considering an 8-ounce jar of hazelnuts costs about $9. Yeah, I've got an idea for a car that runs on bald eagle heads and Fabergé eggs. I thought that was brilliant. But here's the question I wished Fallon, a member of the Artists Against Fracking and thus a public opponent of fossil fuels, has asked. Why are renewable hazelnuts so expensive? After all, their energy comes from the sun, which is free, right? He probably would have responded that while the sun is free, there were other factors in the process of producing hazelnuts that make them expensive. And there are. Here's a key principle for understanding what makes energy cheap, or anything else cheap and plentiful. For something to be cheap and plentiful, every part of the process to produce it, including every input that goes into it, must be cheap and plentiful. With hazelnuts, not only do you have, as in any process, materials, machines, and manpower, you have a huge limiting factor in that the land needed is far from plentiful. Hazelnuts require land with a unique combination of rainfall or irrigation, mild summer climate, and cold winter climate, and fertile soil. This happens overwhelmingly in one place, Turkey, which dominates the market. And this ideal hazelnut habitat generates only one crop a year. What we can call the hazelnut problem comes up over and over again with most of the alternatives to fossil fuels. In some cases, they may be cheap and reliable in small quantities. Some people use French fry oil to power their cars, but making them cheap and reliable in large quantities sufficient to power the lives of billions of people, is a major feat. Just as it's a mistake to assume that because the sun is free, solar-powered hazelnuts will be cheap, so it is a mistake to assume that solar-powered energy can or will be cheap. Whether that's true or not depends on all the materials, manpower, and machines involved in the entire process of harnessing the sun's power. Every energy process requires taking a form of raw energy, there's no ready-made machine energy, and transforming it into a usable form so that it becomes the heat in our homes, the mechanical power of our cars, and the electricity that powers the internet. That is a process that takes time and resources, and the key is to make it as little time and as few resources as possible so that it can be workable, cheap, and plentiful. Workable is a challenge. Cheap and plentiful are an incredible challenge. Hazelnut energy is workable. It just isn't likely to be cheap and plentiful. Another related challenge is dealing with risks and byproducts. Every time energy is transformed, there's the risk of something going wrong. Explosion, electrocution, and there are byproducts that can be harmful, such as sulfur dioxide from coal or radioactive waste generated when mining the materials that go into windmills. Let's look at the technologies worst and best at providing cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. And by plentiful, I mean on a scale of billions of people. For each one, I'll give a brief summary of how it works, how successful it has been at producing cheap, plentiful, and reliable energy, and how it is positioned for the future. I'll start with the most culturally popular energy technologies, solar and wind. The efficiency problems of solar and wind, diluteness and intermittency. Solar and wind energy both work with energy flowing directly from the sun, solar through sunlight, and wind through the sun's heating of different parts of the atmosphere, which is the main cause of wind. Solar energy typically works in one of two ways: solar photovoltaic and concentrated solar power. Solar PV generates electricity through a phenomenon discovered around 1839 by Edmund Becquerel called the photovoltaic effect, by which certain materials emit electrons when hit by light. Through extremely impressive feats of engineering involving precision and often expensive materials, solar PV can generate an electric current when it is exposed to sunlight. The first solar cell was patented in the United States in 1888. CSP, concentrated solar power, by contrast, concentrates sunlight into heat, much as a child does with a magnifying glass when he uses the sun to ignite a dried leaf. Using, in effect, a massive array of magnifying glasses, in this case mirrors, CSP concentrates sunlight into heat, which is used to heat a liquid which generates steam that can power an engine. Wind electricity works when high-velocity wind turbines turn the blades of a wind turbine, which are connected to a generator that converts the wind's power into electric current. In practice, solar and wind technologies have, as we saw before, produced very, very little energy. The top 5 countries ranked by solar energy consumption are Germany, Italy, Spain, Japan, and China. The percentage of each country's electricity that comes from solar energy is respectively 4.5%, 6.3%, 4.0%, 0.9%, and 0.6%. The basic problem is that the process for solar and wind to generate reliable electricity requires so many resources that it's never been cheap and plentiful. In fact, modern solar and wind technology do not produce reliable energy, period. Traditionally, in discussions of solar and wind, there's 2 problems cited: the diluteness problem and the intermittency problem. The diluteness problem is that the sun and wind don't deliver concentrated energy, which means you need a lot of materials per unit of energy produced. For solar, such materials can include highly purified silicon, phosphorus, boron, and compounds like titanium dioxide, cadmium telluride, and copper indium gallium selenide. For wind, they can include high-performance compounds like those used in the aircraft industry for turbine blades and the rare earth metal neodymium for lightweight, high-performance magnets, as well as the steel and concrete necessary to build thousands or tens of thousands of structures as tall as skyscrapers. Such resource requirements are a big cost problem, to be sure, and would be one even if the sun shone all the time and the wind blew all the time. But it's an even bigger problem that the sun and wind don't work that way. That's the big problem, the intermittency problem, or more colloquially, the unreliability program. We know from experience that the sun doesn't shine all the time, let alone with the same intensity all the time. The wind doesn't blow all the time. And leaving aside the assurance that the sun will be off at night, they can be extremely unpredictable. And it appears that the news is just getting better. The Center for American Progress reported that Germany sets a new record, but taking a look at Germany's official energy statistics, skip that. We're going to skip their statistics. Let's see what else we got here. As you look, no, let's see, skip all that. The only way for solar and wind to be truly useful, reliable sources of energy would be to combine them with some form of extremely inexpensive mass storage system. No such mass storage system exists because storing energy in a compact space itself takes a lot of resources, which is why in the entire world there's not one real or proposed independent, freestanding solar or wind power plant. All of them require backup, except that the backup implies that solar and wind work most of the time. It's more accurate to say that solar and wind are parasites that require a host. Here's an analogy. Imagine that you have a company of highly productive, efficient, reliable workers. Then there's an initiative to bring in renewable workers who will supposedly live forever, but they're expensive and you don't know when they'll show up. A document produced by them is not as valuable as a document produced by somebody else because you don't know when theirs will arrive. A company can handle a few such workers, but it can't be run by them. I remember watching an interview of a doctor in Kenya who had to try to run his practice with renewable energy. His clinic was run on solar and could not produce enough electricity to keep both the lights and the refrigerator on at all times. So he had to choose one or the other. When he tried switching on both, an alarm sounded, signifying out of power. So why do environmentalists focus so much on solar and wind despite their intractable problems? The traditional explanation is that they don't generate CO2. Leaving aside the coal and oil needed to manufacture them, you can't build a windmill with a windmill. But as we'll see later, there are other much more scalable forms of energy that don't generate CO2, hydroelectric and nuclear, which environmental leaders oppose, of course. Regardless of one's views on the risks of fossil fuels, it is profoundly irresponsible to claim, as many advocates of solar and wind do, that they are powering Germany, let alone supplying 50% of the power. Seems that there's more focus on getting energy directly from the sun, which is often considered natural, than there is on getting it in a way that will maximize human life. It is deeply irresponsible and disturbing that environmental leaders are telling us to deprive ourselves of fossil fuels on the promise of what can charitably be described as a highly speculative experiment. There's one much more reliable source of renewable energy that is endorsed by many environmental leaders, although with some reluctance: biomass energy. For example, in order to meet renewability mandates, which usually exclude hydroelectric power, Germany and other countries are turning to a renewable biomass fuel from the past to make up for the fact that solar and wind scale so poorly. Wood. And that was the end of section 2 of chapter 2 of the book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. Thank you. And now, this is going to be chapter 9 from Hondo. And when we left the book yesterday from chapter 8, Hondo Lane had been able to make it to the fort and was hanging around for a few days, and finally decided that what he wanted to do was he met up with Angie's husband, Ed Lowe, and Ed Lowe had seemed to have absolutely no interest in trying to rescue his wife and his son. So Hondo Lane decided that he was going to go ahead and leave the fort and go out and try to convince Angie Lo and her son to accompany him back to the fort where they would be safe from Apache attacks. Angie came to the door to shake out her broom. She glanced around the yard, but Johnny was not in sight. A thrill of fright went through her, and she stepped out into the yard. "Johnny! Johnny!" There was no sound. Shading her eyes, she scanned the hills. Johnny was an obedient child. He had been told not to go to the hills, and so far he had always obeyed, going only when they went together. Frightened, she walked quickly around the house. He was nowhere in sight. "Johnny!" Her call sounded, and the empty hills threw back her voice. Her heart pounded heavily. She walked toward the corral. "Johnny! Johnny!" And then from the trees walked two horses. On one of them was Vittoro, and Johnny rode the other. Relief went over her like a cold shower. Yet she looked uncertainly at the hard-faced old Indian. "Oh, I didn't know, I heard nothing. The Apache does not make noise." The old Indian lifted Johnny to the ground, and his hands were gentle, almost fatherly. A hand lingered on the boy's shoulder. "Mommy, Vittorio says I'll make a good warrior." The Apache nodded, starting the child toward his mother. "He will ride well, and he does not fear." "Look, Mommy, I have a headband." Proudly, he showed her the headband. There was an opal of exceptional beauty in the center. She knelt to look at it. "How beautiful! And it has an opal." "It is the emblem of his lodge." Vittoro glanced at Johnny. "I speak with your mother. Go inside the house." "Yes, Vittoro." Obediently, Johnny turned and ran into the house. Angie watched him, a little catch at her heart. Vittoro looked at her, and his eyes were serious. Mentally, she stiffened, for instinctively she knew what was coming, and she knew that she must use every word with care. She had seen several parties of Indians pass, and she had seen the fresh scalps they carried. That she was alive only at the sufferance of Vittoro she knew. Whatever came, he must not be offended. A lodge should have a man. Small warrior should have a father to instruct him. "My husband will be home any day." Vittoro considered this. Then he shook his head. "I do not think so. I think your man is dead. I will deliberate on this." She hesitated, then said quietly, "It is the way of my people for a woman to choose her own man. If my man is dead, there will be another. Many braves ride with me. They follow a strong leader," she said, "but an Apache woman for an Apache man, a white woman for a white man." Vittoro considered this. He said, "Small warrior is a blood brother to Vittoro. He must grow strong in the ways of Vittoro." Her eyes looked frankly into those of the proud old man. "I would have it so. My son could have no better model than Vittoro. I have heard of his greatness. Now I have known it, and he is also kind. My son," she continued slowly, "is born to this land. I would have him know it as the Apache knows it. The man I choose will teach him to know the ways of the Apache." There was nothing to read in his face. He merely turned to his horse. "Of this I shall think," he said, and he walked his horse away into the trees. For a long time after he was gone, she stood perfectly still, forgetful of the hot sun, forgetful of the work that remained to be done. An issue was before her, and she knew she walked a narrow way between life for herself and her son and the death for both of them. Yet she had not lied. She would like her son to know how to live off the country as the Apache did. Yet he must remain true to his blood, true to his God, and true to his people and his country. How long would Vittoro allow her to wait? Not long, that she knew. And then what remained for her? Unless the army came, unless she escaped and abandoned her home, all she had in the world, then she must take a husband from among Vittoro's braves. Yet what had she said? "The man I choose will teach him to know the ways of the Apache." And who of the men she knew could do that? She blushed and bit her lip, unwilling to frame his name in her mind. Yet when she had taken up her broom again, she faced the fact of it. She had never been one to dodge issues. If she knew nothing else, she had learned in these lonely months to know herself, and she knew there was only one man of whom she could think in that way. She was a woman still married, and she was thinking of Hondo Lane. But what was it that made a woman married? Had her husband acted the part of a husband? Had he remained with her? Where was he now in her time of trial? He had never been her husband, not as her father had been to her mother. He had been a young man whom she married and with whom for a time she lived, and he had left no impression here, not even in his son. Mentally, she stood him before Vittoro, and she saw the old chieftain's decision, understood his scorn, and then she saw Hondo Lane, and she stood squarely before Vittoro, and he stood squarely before Vittoro, a man. She worked steadily, yet her thoughts would not remain still. Her problem was with her, and she was a woman born to a Christian life, reared to a moral life, yet always an honest life. Her father had always been a man with whom she could talk, and those talks had reached into her present life with their clear-cut wisdom, their simple truth. To each of us is given a life, to live with honor and to pass on having left our mark. It is our only essential that we do our part, that we leave our children strong. Nothing exists long when its time is past. Wealth is important only to the small of mind. The important thing is to do the best one can with what one has. These things her father had taught her. These things she believed. A woman's task was to keep a home, to rear her children well, to give them as a good start as possible before moving on. That was why she had stayed. That was why she had dared to remain in the face of Indian trouble. This was her home. This was her fireside. Here was all she could give her son aside from the feeling that he was loved, the training she could give, the education. And she could give him this early belief in stability and the rightness of belonging somewhere. Now it was threatened. The very thing that had saved their lives might turn her son from the life that should be his. He was excited by the attentions of the old chief, and he hungered for the company of a man. How else was a boy to learn how to become a man? Was she a fool to think always of Hondo Lane? The man was a killer. But this also her father had given her, reserve of judgment, and to judge no man or woman by a grouping, but each on his own character, his own ground. In Hondo Lane, she had recognized some of the same virtues she had known in her father, the singleness of purpose, the honesty, the steadfastness, and the industry. A killer he might be, but a man must live as he must. There were things a man must face and things a man must do that no woman could understand, just as the reverse was true. Tonight the hills were lonely. A coyote yapped at the moon, and in the silence a quail called. How long did she have? How long before Vittoro came again and demanded a decision of her? But Indians did not permit women to make decisions. Or did they? She had heard not, and yet, knowing women, she was not altogether sure of this. She smiled into the night. Johnny came out and sat on the steps beside her. "Mommy, do you think the man will like my headband? Do you think he will?" "I'm sure of it, Johnny." Then carefully, thinking of the future, she said, "You're a white boy, Johnny, and although someday you may live with the Indians, you will always be a white boy. Mr. Lane lived with the Indians, and he remained a white man." Darkness crept in and crouched around the table, and in the darkness she smelled the sage and heard the stirring and stamping of the horses in the corral. In the east there was a bright star low above the mountains. Would he come back again? Would he come in time? "Mommy," Johnny pulled at her hand, "what will I have to learn to be a warrior?" "Oh, you'll have to learn to track wild animals, to ride, to hunt, to find food in the desert. Many things." "Will I learn to ride like the man did?" "The man? Yes, I think so." She hesitated just a little. "Maybe he'll come back and teach you. He's a good man, Johnny." "I liked him." Johnny watched the quiet star. "I liked the dog, too. But he snapped at you." "But he didn't know me," Johnny said. "He didn't know I was his friend. If a dog let anybody touch him before they were friends, somebody might hurt him." A faint sound caught her ear. She felt her breath. She held her breath, listening. It was the sound of a horse, of many horses, and then she saw them, a dozen Indians, filing by toward the spring. Just beyond the reach of her light, an Indian's horse's eyes caught the light and reflected it. An Indian left the group and started toward them. She got to her feet, recognizing Silva. He stood looking at her. There was a pride in his bearing and contempt, too. He gestured at her head, then lifted a scalp. It was fresh, red-haired. Another Indian came up behind him and said something. Silva hesitated, looking from her to the child. The other Indian spoke again, more urgently. The only word she knew was Vittorio. The second Indian used the name several times. Silva turned away finally and walked back to the horses. She stood very still, holding Johnny tightly to her until she heard their horses moving away. For a long time after they were gone, she was uneasy. Inside, she checked the pistol again. Since Hondo had loaded it and since Johnny had nearly killed Silva, she always kept it loaded. Silva would come back. He would come alone. Afterward, he could always blame some other Indians for what was done. He had forgotten nothing, and he would not forget. Her only hope was to have a man of her own. But who could stand against Silva if anything happened to Vittorio? She asked the question into the night and gave her heart, and her heart gave the answer. And that was chapter 9 of the book Hondo by Louis L'Amour. And I like, one of the things I really like about this book is that it really shows and emphasizes character. In today's culture, the left has pushed character aside, and character is no longer how you judge people. You simply judge them on their personality. And we know this with absolute certainty because of when you watch the news segments about people that have been killed or died, maybe in automobile accidents or whatever, and the relatives will very often say that so-and-so's, the one I hear most often is his or her smile lit up the room. And it's like, so what? So what? Dogs get a better send-off than that. And that's because, again, they don't know what else to do. They're judging everybody based on personality. This is also how people go wrong in their relationships. If you're going to marry somebody and you think, well, he's got a good personality, he's quick with a joke or to light up your smoke, but you don't consider his character. And this book emphasizes character, the character of all the characters there, male and female. So that was chapter 9 of the book Hondo. Back in a minute. Thank you. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all of the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers, and reminding you to listen to the John and Ken Show on KFI AM 640, Monday through Friday from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Pacific Time. Also, KFI needs to bring back Bryan-Suits and his show, The Dark Secret Place. Hashtag bring back Bryan-Suits. Until next time, be honest, be smart, be beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.